the body of Jesus. Now Joseph was a disciple of Jesus, but secretly, because he feared the Jews. With Pilate's permission, he came and took the body away. He was accompanied by Nicodemus, the man who had earlier visited Jesus at night. Nicodemus brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 75 pounds. Taking Jesus' body, the two of them wrapped it with the spices in strips of linen. This was in accordance with Jewish burial customs. At the place where Jesus was crucified, there was a garden, and in the garden a new tomb in which no one had ever been laid, because it was the Jewish day of preparation, and since the tomb was nearby, they laid Jesus there. First tonight, I know already you can see a lot of these prophecies fulfilled from the Psalms we had earlier in our liturgy and what we just read here. And maybe some of that's fairly obvious, but something we need to remember, that the Bible is trustworthy, and to the finest detail, prophecy was fulfilled, especially on this Good Friday afternoon and evening. Now, the first part might seem a little strange why it's included, other than it was a prophecy. So the soldiers gambling for his clothes. Now, already a lot of these soldiers have been brutal to Jesus, and even though they didn't really have any concern for the Jewish leaders anyway, they kind of took it to had fun just taunting Jesus. And now, this might not seem quite as bad, but it's pretty humiliating. He's dying there on the cross, suffering, and they're gambling for his clothes, which was foretold in the Old Testament. Now, for the things they could split up. Evidently, these soldiers weren't paid that well back then. Doesn't seem like it, because this was traditional part of their pay, I guess, when they crucified people, criminals, they got to keep the clothes. So the first four of these could be split up pretty easily. Jesus' turban or headdress, his outer robe, and then his sash and his sandals, so they could split those up. But then the undergarment was one seam, so they weren't going to cut it up. It wouldn't be worth anything, so they gambled for that. So, not to talk about this all night, but amazing how, to the finest detail, this was fulfilled. From Psalm 22, where we see how Jesus was suffering many years before, how it says in the Old Testament. The next part, Jesus' mother Mary and his disciple John, this part isn't directly prophesied, but we see Jesus suffering on the cross, suffering the pains of hell, not only the crucifixion itself, but also God the Father actually temporarily withdrawing his help and support, and that's why Jesus shouted out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" So, through the midst of all this, he sees John, sees his mother. So we know there's three Marys there. There's Mary, his mother, there's Mary Magdalene, there's Mary, wife of Clopas, who we don't know much about. And it says Mary's sister, who a lot of scholars, Bible scholars, think may have been Salome, who was John and James' mother. So in that sense, Jesus was like a cousin of John. So none of Jesus' brothers were there. He had earthly brothers. We saw earlier in another text that they kind of deserted him, thought he was crazy. Although one of his brothers later, we're pretty sure it was his earthly brother, wrote the book of James, a different James. Anyway, John was his good disciple, and he was concerned for his mother. And people take out of context other things earlier that happened when Jesus was about his business, but he never disrespected his mother. And we can only, you and I know how the bond is between mother and child, and we can't even fathom how she was feeling at this point. Even, she had to think back at Christmas, a joyous time, even those humble times in the stable where she pondered these things in her heart. And then all through his ministry, he turned the water into wine, his first miracle, and she told him to do whatever he says. And she had to think back at all these things, and it was hard for everyone. It had to be especially hard on her. So Jesus had compassion on her, just like he has compassion on us through our sufferings, although none of us can compare to what he went through. So he basically told John, here's your mother, told his mother, and she went in with him, and he took her in. Now, some scholars say maybe this is why he doesn't have some of the later accounts of what Jesus said, because he actually went right away. But regardless, he wrote his gospel later, John, and he's well aware of what the other gospel writers wrote. So he gives us a perspective of some other things. He was there personally. So Jesus is still fulfilling the law even as he's dying on the cross, concerned for his mother. Now the next part, this prophecy, I thirst, he said, and this is like actually right before he died almost. So this wasn't like early on where he said, oh, I'm thirsty, or middle of the whole ordeal. It was just late in the, once again, to fulfill the prophecy. Also proving that he was true man besides true God, and he was suffering intensely, and he was thirsty. As I said, this was right before he died. So he experienced human feelings all through his life on earth, and sometimes it seems just strange to think about it and talk about it, that he was true man living on earth. He did miracles, but he never did them to help himself, and he suffered. He was humble throughout his life. He felt a lot of the human emotions that we do. One thing he never felt, though, was guilt, because he never sinned. So there's one difference right there. But now on the cross, he's taking on the sins of the whole world, everyone in the world. So they gave him, the soldiers, they gave him vinegar, a cheap sour wine probably. This is probably what the soldiers drank while they're waiting through this whole thing. Remember, they're there to get their pay watching this. And early on, of course, a lot of people were taunting Jesus, including the two criminals, and then eventually it started turning dark. And I think the movie had a pretty accurate Passion of the Christ. People started getting scared. Some of them, it got real dark, and things just didn't seem natural. So we see Jesus, he is actually very coherent, and even though he's suffering up to the very end, he knows what's going on. And we can see that because he speaks just before his death. The other thieves are clinging to their lives, and they both rebuked them, and we'll talk a little later about an account from Matthew, though, the famous account of the thief who did repent. So now in death, as it says in verse 31, it was the day of the preparation. So the Jews didn't want the bodies left on the cross, so they had Pilate had asked to have his legs broken. Of course, it was prophesied that his legs wouldn't be broken, and we see what happens here. It says, the soldiers therefore came and broke the legs of the first man, one of the thieves who had been crucified with Jesus, and then those of the other. But when they came to Jesus and found that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. Instead, one of the soldiers pierced Jesus' side with a spear, bringing a sudden flow of blood and water. So once again, to the T from the Old Testament, fulfilling what said would happen. I don't know how anyone really can read the Old Testament and study it and not see these analogies. It's so obvious, and it's actually saying what did happen. I won't quote everything from the Old Testament, but take my word for it. You can check up on me later if you want. Exodus 12, Numbers 9, Psalm 34, Zechariah 12, verse 10. These accounts are all there, exactly what happened. So these Roman soldiers, like I said, a lot of them at least seemed pretty cruel, but they weren't impartial witnesses. They didn't have any love lost for these Jewish leaders either. So for them, and John makes a big deal about it here because John wrote his gospel later on in his life, and he knew that people were trying to say either Jesus didn't really die, or he didn't really rise from the dead. So he says right here that the man who saw it's given his testimony, and it's true. He knows he tells the truth and testifies so you may believe. So we have impartial witnesses here, the soldiers. And Jesus was definitely buried. Tonight, we did read it. We won't get into too much detail about Jesus' burial, but he was definitely dead. Now, when these soldiers pierced his side, it was probably, as it says here, to make sure he was dead, but they didn't break his bones. It also might have been one more sadistic, one last thing. We don't know for sure. We have one verse here from Matthew 27 now. When the centurion and all those who were with him, who were guarding Jesus, saw the earthquake, okay, this is when Jesus died, and all that happened, they were terrified and exclaimed, surely he was the Son of God. So here we have testimony once again from sources we wouldn't expect. Basically, some people's minds were changed already here. We have the one criminal who we'll talk about in a minute, the Roman centurion who said this, and then also Joseph and Nicodemus, who already were believers, but secretly and now openly came out and helped with Jesus' burial. So we go from finest detail, which is important. All Scripture is trustworthy, but the most important thing we get now is the final triumph. Backtracking just a little to when Jesus said, it is finished. Was it really finished? Well, when he said that, it wasn't resignation like, oh, these guys Well, I'm sure he was relieved it was finished also, but the main point was